Again, and welcome back to our JavaScript data visualization project. Where we left off last time was this visualization here of some of the Titanic data. And what I'd like to do in this video is cover some more ideas that you could incorporate to this. Now, you don't have to use these exactly the way that I'm doing it. You can build on this and expand it or change it or make it your own thing. Okay, so what I'd like to do here, and I think this is interesting what we have, but what I'd like to do is be able to hover over any one of these little squares here and then see all of the information for any one of the passengers. So each one of these objects here represents a passenger, right? And along the way, we'll pick up some general JavaScript knowledge that could be applied to any project, right? Okay, so here's the code that we have. This is the code where I left off in the last video, and I have a div here called Titanic, and this is where all the passenger divs are added. And then this one right here displays all of the 5 bars that we see right here, right? So what I want to do is I want to add a new div. And this div is going to display details about a passenger. So I'll give it an ID name here, and I'll call it passenger details, okay? And there's nothing in here, but there could be, right? So, we can do that with code, right? So we'll say passenger info will end up here, okay? So this is our ID name. Why don't we copy that? And I'm going to go to script.js, and in script.js, what I want to do is I'm going to actually scroll to, let me actually rearrange this a little bit, right? So I'm going to just scroll to the bottom, and I'm going to do all this work down here, just out of the way of all the script up above, right? And you could arrange your code how you think is best for what you're working on, right? I'm just going to put it here for clarity. So the other code up, so it doesn't get mixed in with the other code up there. We'll have to make some edits up here too. But the first thing we're going to do is we want to get a reference to that passenger details div. So let's make a variable equal to document.querySelector. And then we'll put the name passenger details here. That line's kind of long. Let me expand the window a little bit here, right? So it's going to look like this. I got passenger details as my variable. I'll use document.querySelector and then hashtag passenger details. Like, so this says that passenger details is an ID. Okay. Okay, great. So our next step here is to create a event listener that will register when the cursor enters one of these passenger divs, okay? So let's add that in here. I'm going to say document.body. Now, the way we're going to do this is rather than adding an event listener to every single one of these divs, we're going to put one event listener on the body. This is an idea called event delegation, right? And what's great about this is if we, since we're generating the divs here dynamically, if they don't exist at the time that we try to add the event listener, then we have a problem, right? If we add an event listener to every one of these, we've just added, almost 900 event listeners, right? And that's kind of a problem too, right? Because it's a lot more work for the computer to understand, right? So what we're going to do is we're just going to add a single event listener to the body tag, and the body tag always exists, so we don't have to worry that it might not be there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the event object that is passed to this listener, and we're going to ask it like, hey, did this event occur at one of the divs here? And if it did, then do something, okay? So let's set that up. So we'll make this window a little wider here. I'll zoom in on this, right? And the event we're going to listen for is a mouse over, okay? And we'll handle it with an event handler, which is a function, right? So we'll use an arrow function. And this function takes an event object. I'm just going to call it E, but you could spell it out as event. Some people spell it as EVT, right? Since this is a parameter variable, you get to make up the name, right? So I'm just going to use the name E. Okay, great. So now what are we going to do with our event object, right? I'm going to put an if statement in here, and I'll say event.target. So the event object describes the event that just occurred. So when an event occurs on the body tag, then the event object is passed to this function, right? Or at least when a mouse over event occurs, then this function is called and an event object is created and passed in here. And that event object contains properties that describe the event that just occurred. And there's like 100 properties on this event object, right? So it gives us a very detailed view of what just happened. One of the properties is called the target. And the target is the object where the event occurs. So, like the body might be listening for the event, but the event may have occurred at one of these divs here or one of the divs down here or somewhere else, okay? So we've got our event object here. And what I want to ask is, hey, does this object match a certain description, right? So what we can do is we can say dot matches, and the dot matches function says like, hey, does this thing match the description here? And the description that you can put in there is it can be any CSS selector, and if that CSS selector matches the object that generated the event, then this will return true. Okay, so now we just have to come up with some way to identify these divs here, right, through a CSS selector. And there's a couple ways to do this, right? Remember, all of those divs are going to be inside of this. Let me go get it right here. They're going to be inside this Titanic embarked div, right? So like if I look here, actually they're going to be inside this Titanic div, right? So if they're anything that's inside here, if it's a child of ID Titanic div, then it would be one of those divs, right? Another way to do it would be to give each of these divs a class name, right? And that would be kind of a nice way to do it, because then we could also use the class name to style them or do other things, right? So why don't we try that? So a couple things that would work here are, one, actually, let me scroll to the bottom again. We could say oops, for some reason it wanted to spell check me there, but that is not what I wanted to write. So I'm going to say Titanic, and then I could say child div, right? But I think what would be, this is a little abstract, hard to tell what's going on there. I think what would be better for us is if we had a passenger, but it's a class name, right? So I put a dot there, right? So every one of those boxes represents a passenger. So I think if we give it a class name, then that would be kind of good for us, right? And then this name is very descriptive, okay? So, so now that we're doing this, we need to make sure that every div has the class name passenger, right? So each one of these should have the class name passenger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the point where I made those divs. You may have done this in a different location. I think I created the divs here, and then I appended them here, and I sorted them a couple times. And then right here, I looped over each div and I set its style and some other properties. So I think maybe in this function right here, when I loop over all the passenger divs, let's also add a class name, right? So this passenger, the P, is one of these divs, right? So this P represents an HTML element that is a passenger, and it's one of these divs, right? So it's not, this P isn't the data, right? It's the HTML element. So I'm going to say ClassList.add, and this is how we add a class name dynamically to an HTML element. So we say element.ClassList.add, and you can do .remove also, or toggle. So let's add the pass name the class name passenger. And here we're not going to use the dot because the class name, we're just spelling it out, right? Outside, when we have to say whether it's a class or an ID, we'll put the dot in front of it to say that it's a class. So here it's sure that it's a class, so we just put the name, okay? So there we go. So we've got, everybody has a name there. Let's see if this works, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say console.log, and we'll test this out. So we'll say mouse enter passenger, right? And we can go get our console here, and I'll pull the console up. And you can see as I hover over there, you can see I hovered over mouse enter passenger like 13 times, right? So every time I hover over one of these guys, it counts up another one. So that seems to be working, right? Okay, so next, maybe we also need to have an ID. So all of the passengers here represent one of the elements in our data array, right? But they're associated by index, so we have to match up the index. This would be like passenger 0, passenger 1, passenger 2, etc., right? So that means every passenger div also needs to know which index it is. So we can do that by adding an attribute. There's a few ways we could do this, but the easy way, I think, is to add an attribute to each passenger. And an attribute looks like this. Let me actually make a comment here. So we want each div to look like this, right? With a class of passenger, which we added the class name here, right? And what we also want to do is we want to say data ID equals some number, right? So the very first one right here will be data ID 0, okay? So to add a data attribute, so data attributes always begin with data hyphen, right? And that's specifically the way that the W3C wants developers to store data on HTML tags. So if you have any information you want to add to a tag, you'll do it this way with a data attribute. And you can put any name you want after data dash, right? So to add a new attribute, what we'll do is we'll say p.dataset.name of attribute. And then here I can set it to I. So I is the index of the passenger in the array, right? There we go. Okay, and now if I'm to look at this in the terminal here, you can see that I've got, let me see here. Let me open this guy up. You can see here's my my first passenger right there, and it says data ID 0, and then here's the second passenger, and it says data ID number 1. Okay, so great. So now that's working, right? Okay, so our next bit is that we want to add some information to the passenger details div, which will be the data from our data array, right? And we're going to know to get the element from the data array using the data ID that we just attached to the passenger div. Okay, so let's try that, right? So just for fun, maybe instead of showing the message here, why don't we replace this with something else? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const ID equals e.target.dataset.id. So remember earlier we added an ID to the data set of one of our HTML elements. We just checked to see that this e.target is or has the class name passenger, so it must be one of the divs here. And so we can say that element.dataset.id to get the ID value, okay? So again, ID is the index in our data array where the Titanic data for that passenger is stored. So we can go to our data array and use the ID to get at that passenger's data, right? So let's try that now. So we're going to log that to the console. I'm going to inspect here and see what it says in the console. Oh yeah, there's a bunch of objects there. Let me actually clear this and do it again. So I'll hover over this passenger here, and you can see there's one of those elements from our Titanic data, right? And if I look at fields here, I can see that this was Carter Mr. William Ernest, okay? And if I hover over this one right here, I'll see another object down here, and this was Piers Mrs. Thomas Edith Wern, I guess. I don't know how to pronounce that right. So anyway, so we're doing pretty good. So now let's take this data rather than logging it to the console, and let's put it into the passenger details div. So remember, this is a reference to a div that we have. So let's do that, right? We can get rid of that console log. Let's say passenger details dot inner HTML equals, and why don't we do this? Let's put some tags in here. I'm actually going to add a line return there because it'll be maybe easier to read. Let's put a strong tag for the passenger's name. So inner HTML is just going to add all of this here into or between the two tags for the div, that is the passenger details div, right? So it's just going to put all of this inside there. And so we can write whatever HTML we want in here, right? This is a string though, so we got to make sure that we concatenate any variables we have. You know, whenever we use the data from the Titanic, it's a little bit annoying because you have to say, you know, data bracket ID dot fields dot name, right? Like that's kind of long and complicated. Let's actually take a look and see if that works. Oh yeah, look, so I'm hovering over and I can see all the passenger names here, right? Okay, so that works, but it's a little awkward to write this out. And if I had to do that for all the properties I wanted to display, maybe it would be kind of a problem. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to say const fields, and this will just be this object here, right? So what I think I'll do is I'll copy this here and just get the fields object, and then I can just get rid of this first part there. And you could go further. You could break this down using deconstruction to just get the name, age, fare, and what other information you wanted, right? Maybe that would actually be better, but I think I'm going to stick with this for now. So now that I've got my strong tag, maybe I want to create a list. So I'll just do a UL tag here, and I'll close it off, and then I'll add an LI tag, right? That's just like everyday HTML. And what I want to do here is maybe display the age of the person. So let's actually put age colon so we know what the number is, and then we'll say fields dot age, right? And you know, we can rinse and repeat for all of the properties. Maybe I want to know how much they paid for their fare, so I'll say fare here, and then I'll leave adding the other properties as a challenge problem for you. So you can pick which properties you want to display, and you can say how you're going to display them. So let's save that and then hover over some other passengers here. So it looks like Alhomaki Mr. Ilmari Rudolph. Age, wait, oops, I lost his, oh, there he is, right? Age 20, paid 7.925, right? Coots, Master Eden Leslie Neville, paid 15. He survived those. Maybe if you pay more, you survive, right? So Neville survived, right? He's age 9. Oh, I guess he was a child, right? So, so he, you know, they put him in the boat first. Let's see. Maybe we can use this information to figure out why these don't seem to be sorting correctly, right? Maybe that can tell us something. So anyway, so we've gone pretty far here. Let's do one more thing. So I like what I have here, but this is a little weird that these things end up way down here. It'd be kind of cool, like if I hovered over this and a little box showed up right next to the cursor, right? So I could see each passenger. So let's try and handle that, right? So what we can do is we can set the position property of the div down here to absolute, and then we can position it by its left and top at the same position as the cursor. Okay, so let's give that a try. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, inside the event listener here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get to the passenger details object or element, right? So that's the div. And let's set its style. So I'm going to set the style to position, and then the value will be absolute, okay? And then I'm going to set another style property. So I'll say style.left equals, and now, like, how do I know where the cursor is at? Well, again, this event object tells us. So when an event occurs, the event object will give us the position of the cursor. It actually gives it to you in a few ways. There's, I think there's a mouse X and Y, and there's also a page X and page Y, okay? So we're going to use the page X and page Y here. So we'll say left, and remember, style properties have to have a unit, so I'll put px on the end here, but I'll set the left to e dot page x, okay? And then I'll do it again, passenger details dot style dot top, and I'll set this equal to e dot page y and px, okay? So let's try it. Oh, look, there we are, right? So that's looking pretty good, right? Not bad. Maybe it needs a little bit of style, maybe like a background color and a border. Maybe we might even want to set the width or height of it. I don't know, right? So let's try another one. So I'm going to add, I'm still inside this event listener, right? So when you hover over, when the mouse is over one of these passenger divs, we're going to set all these styles. These styles, actually, we don't need to set them every time. So you could actually move these into your style sheet and you would be good. But I'm going to just do all the code in JavaScript, right? Because that's something to know, right? So I'm going to say passenger details dot style dot background color equals FFF, right? And what else? Maybe let's put a border on it. So I'll say passenger details dot style dot border equals 1 pixel solid. We could have broke this down into 2 styles. For some reason, whenever I do border, I always just do it as one style rather than doing border width and border style, right, as separate properties. Oh, so that's looking a little better, right? That's not bad. So that's okay. It's kind of weird when I hover off and this still stays there, so we should put that away. And then maybe it needs a little bit of margin or padding because the text goes right up to the edge of the border there. So let's add one more style here. Let's add some padding. So let's say passenger details dot style dot padding equals, and let's do 0.5 em. Okay. Oh, I did passing. That is not a word, or it's not a style. It's a word, but it's not a style, right? Okay. Oh, there we go. So that's looking a lot better. There's a little space there. Gives it some room to breathe. Now let's add. Let's remove this when we hover off, right, or move off, right? So I've got a mouse over event. There's also a mouse out event. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite of mouse over. So I have to add another event listener, but we'll use the same event delegation strategy. So instead of adding a mouse event to every div, we'll add just one event to the body and then check that the target matches some description. Okay, so let's try that. Let's type it all over. Actually, try it on your own. Okay. How did you do? I'll go through the solution here, right? So let's say document dot body dot add event listener event in our case is mouse out. We'll need a handler for this, which is a function. Our function needs to accept the event object. Like we're going to we got a lot of mileage up here out of this event object, right? And now what we're going to do is we're going to delegate. So, or this is going to be our delegate right here, right? So we want to figure out if what just occurred happening at the target matches this description, right? And for us, the description is passenger class, right? Or has class name passenger, right? And there's a few ways you might handle this. I like this matches method. It's just really easy to work with if you understand the CSS selectors, right? So I think this like CSS selector language and the whole idea of selectors is really amazing. When you get to know it and use it, it actually is really good, you know? Okay, great. So how do we hide our passenger detail object? Well, to show it, what I did is I set the position property to absolute, but that won't hide it, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say passenger details dot style dot display, right? And display has a few values that you can assign to it. One of them is none, and that means like don't show this thing, right? Okay. But if we set this display style to none, that means up here when we want to show the thing again, it's still going to be display none unless we change the display property to something else, right? So by default, the div is display block. So I'm going to say display block again. Okay. So this will show our div, and then these things will position and style it. And down here, this will hide our passenger details div. Let's try it, right? So, oh yeah, there we go, right? So Anderson, Mr. Harry, age 48, paid $26.55, right? So that's pretty good. Notice as I move kind of diagonally, the thing kind of flickers, right? Do you see that? Right? And I think that's because we're actually, like if I move the cursor fast enough, it overlaps the box with the name in it, right? The details box. So actually we don't want that to happen. So maybe, you know, just to fix this a little bit, you know what I'm gonna, because it's the box is right at the cursor. It's at the location of the mouse, right? So if I just move just like a little bit down and to the left, I kind of end up hovering over the box and it flickers, right? So why don't we position it a little further down and a little bit more to the left? So maybe this is where we're setting the position. This puts it like right on top of the cursor. Why don't we set it to the page X plus 3 and the page Y plus 3? So now you can see it's like a little bit down and to the left of where the cursor is, right? That's not too bad. It doesn't move exactly with the cursor. We might want to actually do a mouse move event. But anyway, I think that's pretty good for now. So let's hold on that. There's an idea. We walked through a whole bunch of ideas here to get the like this box to show up with the details in it. Let's do a quick review. What did we do? We added a new element. This one down here actually, right? So we got a new HTML element. We got a reference to that element from its ID. And then we added an event listener to the body tag. Okay, and we're listening for the mouse over event. Why add the listener to the body? It's because we don't want to add a listener for 900 elements, and those elements are generated dynamically, which could be a problem, right? Because maybe we're trying to add an event listener, but the element doesn't exist, and then that would fail, right? And if they get added and removed also through some code action, then their event listeners would need to be reset, right? So better for us is to use event delegation. Here, the body handles all events, and then we just look at the event target to see if it matches an object that we're listening or looking at, okay? Listening to or looking at, right? Next, each of those objects, we gave it some special properties. So we gave a class name, so we added the class name dynamically using class list, right? And then we also added an attribute. to each of the divs over here. So we added a special data attribute, and it's going to be data ID. So this is actually going to generate data-id as some value, right? And the number, this will be like I will be there, right? Okay. And then after that, we just set styles like we did in the previous class. I did use inner HTML here to show other information. And again, like my challenge to you is for you to show more information. See what other kinds of information you could grab out of the Titanic data to display in the overlay. Okay, so anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that that's interesting and helpful and maybe spark some ideas for you.